Our first stop was Spoleto. Dominating the town is its medieval castle and bridge. The castle, or rocca, dates to the 14th century, although its foundations date back to Roman times when an acropolis stood here. The bridge, Ponte della Torri, spans a width of 750 feet and towers 260 feet above the gorge. It too was built in the 14th century, this time on the foundations of a Roman aqueduct. San Pietro Church stands on the outskirts of Spoleto. It has a beautifully carved front facade from the 12th century. The most interesting carvings are in the lower section, depicting various biblical stories and motifs rich with Christian symbolism. Spoleto's cathedral, or Duomo, dates to the 12th century. The unique facade, with 8 rose windows, features a mosaic done in 1207, depicting Christ between the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist. Inside, the most notable feature is the beautiful fresco cycle in the apse, done by Filippo Lippi in the 1460s and depicting the life of the Virgin Mary. The magnificently colored image in the curving space above is that of the coronation of the Virgin. Here we see Mary in heaven being crowned by God Himself, with a rainbow of saints and Old Testament figures looking on. Learning more about St. Francis was one focus of our trip. We began that quest here, in the hills east of Assisi. Nestled in the woods on the slopes of Mount Sabasio is the Eremo della Carceri, a Benedictine hermitage that had been in existence for 600 years by the time Francis arrived. But it was this monastery that initially supported Francis's efforts and to which he frequently returned. The Eremo is a warren of very small rooms, some carved out of the mountain itself. Some served as chapels, others as monks' cells. Here we can see the steep slope to which the monastery clings. Francis loved nature. In fact, this is thought to be the tree where Francis preached his famous Sermon to the Birds. And this is one of the caves in the monastery complex where Francis retreated from time to be alone and to pray. Francis often returned to the Eremo during his life to contemplate and to pray. The peacefully isolated church and monastery on the densely wooded mountainside retain the tranquil, contemplative air St. Francis so prized. On our second day, we visited Perugia, the capital of Umbria. On the town's main piazza, we found the 10th century Duomo with its unfinished front facade, and this beautiful fountain, Fontana Maggiore. This Gothic masterpiece was carved out of white and pink marble by the famous sculptors Nicola and Giovanni Pisano. Completed in 1278 to celebrate the construction of an aqueduct that brought water to Perugia from mountains 5 miles away, the fountain was recently restored, revealing its original beauty. Across the piazza from the Duomo, on the other side of the fountain, is the Palazzo dei Priori, built in the early 1300s as the seat of government. Today, it houses the National Art Gallery of Umbria, which we'll visit later. The 2 bronzes over the door represent a griffin and a lion, the 2 symbols of Perugia, while the balcony affords lovely views over the square. The entrance to the National Gallery of Umbria is marked by an impressively carved doorway. This museum is the main reason we came to Perugia. It occupies several floors in the Palazzo dei Priori and houses one of the finest art collections in Italy after those of Rome, Florence, and Venice. Among the medieval masterpieces on display are Piero della Francesca's Polyptych of St. Anthony, done in 1470, and Perugino's St. Augustine and the Adoration of the Shepherds from a similar time frame. But our favorite area of the museum was one devoted to earlier ecclesiastical pieces, much of it by unknown artists, such as this crucifix from the year 1270. In a different part of the Palazzo dei Priori is another museum of sorts, the Collegio del Cambio, or Bankers' Meeting Hall. Merchant guilds held significant power and influence in medieval Perugia, and the bankers were no exception, as evidenced by the sumptuous woodwork and exceptional frescoes that adorn the interior. The main room was painted by Perugino himself in the 15th century. Here he depicts the Transfiguration. The adjoining chapel of St. John the Baptist was painted a number of years later by one of Perugino's students, with a stunning ceiling, and a rather graphic portrayal of the saint's execution. In another part of town, we came across the charming little Oratorio di San Bernardino. Built in 1452, this delightful Renaissance masterpiece has a facade made up of delicately carved, multicolored marble. Santa Maria degli Angeli is the name of the town and the basilica located a short distance from Assisi. It was in this area that Francis first set up shop with a handful of followers in what was to become known as the Franciscan Order. The monks of the Eremo della Carceri, which we saw earlier, gave Francis a tiny, dilapidated chapel on this spot, in what was then a fairly remote area west of town. After Francis's death, when hordes of pilgrims came to visit the site, this massive basilica was built to accommodate them. But rather than tear down the original chapel, they built this huge basilica around it, a church within a church, so that even today you can visit Francis's tiny original chapel safely tucked away inside Christendom's 7th largest cathedral. Nearby, also within the basilica, is another structure that dates back to Francis's original settlement, the hut in which he died. Elsewhere throughout the cathedral complex are other rooms and hallways beautifully adorned with colorful frescoes. In one corner was this statue of Francis and a very real bird. We're not sure what Francis would have thought of the massive basilica, but we're confident he would have liked this touch. Assisi, of course, will forever be associated with St. Francis, and there are indeed many significant, historic sites to visit here. But the town itself is simply charming, so we begin by taking a peek at the streets and neighborhoods of Assisi. Assisi's Duomo, dedicated to San Rufino, has a splendid 12th century Romanesque facade and matching bell tower. For 1,000 years before Francis made it on the scene, Rufino had been Assisi's patron saint, having been martyred here in the 3rd century. The facade of his church has beautiful rose windows surrounded by curious early carvings. Below, the doorways have even more intricate artwork. The lion statues guarding the central door portray the method of Rufino's martyrdom at the hands of the Romans. The interior was decorated in the 16th century with many frescoes, paintings, and sculptures. It was in this Duomo that both Francis and Clare, about whom we'll hear more later, were baptized as children, long before their destinies were known. Just outside the Duomo, in the Piazza San Rufino, the view is dominated by the Rocca Maggiore, the town's 14th century fortress, with foundations dating back to Roman and even Etruscan times. Nearby, just outside the town walls, the hill on which Assisi is built plummets into the valley below. The 13th century Basilica di Santa Chiara is dedicated to Saint Clare, an early follower of Saint Francis and founder of the Order of the Poor Clares. She was 18 years old when she encountered the teachings of the then 30-year-old Francis, leaving her wealthy parents and a life of luxury to adopt an extremely austere existence which impressed popes and commoners alike, drawing many to follow in her footsteps. Today, the basilica which bears her name is situated on a lively square with a fountain in its center. The street running alongside the basilica illustrates the growth of Assisi over the centuries. This 13th century gateway, just beyond the basilica, marks the spot to which the medieval town walls had just been extended in order to accommodate the ever-expanding population of Assisi. But as we walk up the street toward the center of Assisi, we come upon a far more ancient gate in the Roman town walls, which encircled a somewhat smaller town. The Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva began its life as a Roman temple in the 1st century BC. A church was built on top of the temple foundations in the 9th century, hence the name Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which means Mary over Minerva. With its powerful Corinthian columns, it's considered the best preserved Roman temple in all of Italy after the Pantheon. It's situated on the main square of Assisi, the Piazza del Comune. The tower doesn't actually belong to the church, but to the adjoining Palazzo Capitano del Popolo, the first public building to be erected on the square in the 13th century. Inside, the church was given a flamboyant Baroque interior in the 1600s. It incorporates the original floor stones of the Roman temple, including the drains for the bloody sacrifices that took place here. One evening, we happened upon a small church choir that was touring Italy and decided to have an impromptu performance on the steps of the temple. The tiny Romanesque church of Santo Stefano is perched on a hillside in Assisi with a beautiful view of the valley below, including, in the distance, the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, which we had visited previously. The interior of the church is simple, with a few faded frescoes, but it afforded one of those special moments when the other three people in the church started singing, quietly and reverently. The Via San Francesco leads us out from the center of town past this gate, which marks the extent of the town walls in Francis's day. The street continues on for another quarter-mile or so to the resting place of St. Francis, who was buried, at his request, outside the town walls alongside the graves not of the elite, but of the outcasts to whom he ministered. Soon thereafter, that resting place was enshrined by the Basilica of St. Francis. The church has two levels, the upper basilica and the lower basilica. The upper basilica opens onto the raised Piazza Superiore on the right and has a traditional facade with a fine rose window. By contrast, the entrance to the lower basilica is tucked away down a long staircase along the side of the church and is accessed via this lower doorway. St. Francis himself greets you as you enter this oldest part of the church. The dark Romanesque interior is nonetheless made vibrant by the paintings of 13th century masters such as Cimabue, Giotto, and their students. Some of the more famous paintings are St. Francis preaching to the birds, St. Francis receiving the stigmata, and the allegories of the virtues, including this one depicting poverty. Poorly dressed, her feet resting in brambles, Christ takes her arm and puts it in Francis's, who places a wedding ring on her finger, while the small figures in the foreground, representing the wealthy merchants of medieval Italy, demonstrate their contempt for Lady Poverty by throwing stones at her. In the crypt beneath the lower basilica is the actual tomb of St. Francis. As we exit the lower church and climb to the upper basilica, we pass this arcaded inner courtyard. In contrast to the lower church, the upper basilica is brighter and airier, following the Gothic paradigm. It is frescoed from top to bottom by Giotto, with 28 scenes from the life of St. Francis, including this one where the hand of God looks on approvingly as St. Francis, upon his conversion, relinquishes his worldly possessions, even to the point of handing his clothes to his earthly father as he swears allegiance to his heavenly Father alone. The town of Spelo has a surprising number of ancient Roman gates still surviving in its town walls. This one, the main gate of town, is the Porta Consolare. Its tower was added in the Middle Ages. These villages are called hill towns for a reason, as Pam demonstrates. But soon we reach the flower-festooned neighborhoods further up the hill. In fact, Spelo would be celebrating its annual flower festival the very next day. We got to enjoy all of the flowers and none of the crowds. The first church we encountered was Santa Maria Maggiore, with its beautifully carved doors dating back to the 1500s. The church doesn't allow photography inside, so we took a few shots from outside the doors, peeking in. But the real prize among Spelo's many churches is San Andrea. It has a stunningly painted interior with an evocative crucifix suspended over the main altar. In another part of the church are some early frescoes. Perhaps the most dramatic of Spelo's Roman gates is the Porta Venere. We also took a peek inside the Church of San Lorenzo. One final Roman gate has only its archway remaining. The adjoining park offers lovely views of the countryside. That's Assisi in the distance. Trevi's hillside location makes it especially picturesque as you approach. In fact, we found that to be its greatest charm. The town's Romanesque Duomo, dedicated to Saint Emiliano, dates to the 12th century. Emiliano, an early church leader, was thrown to the lions by the Romans, but he treated the beasts gently, even blessed them, causing them to do no harm and eventually just walk away. Not far away is the town of Montefalco, which is renowned for its fine red wines. This palazzo stands on the main square of town, along with many wine shops selling the town's famous Sagrantino wine. Montefalco's largest church is dedicated to the town's own Santa Chiara, who lived about 100 years after St. Clare of Assisi, and whose relics are contained in this fine altar. The much smaller Santa Illuminata dates to the 14th century. The oldest church in Montefalco, Santa Lucia, dates all the way back to the 12th century. It's also the town's tiniest church, with remnants of some early frescoes on the wall, including this one of Santa Lucia. The pleasant little town of Bevagna was only a few miles down the road from our hotel, so we actually visited a couple of times. Bevagna has all the characteristics of other charming hill towns except one, the hill. The main square of town, Piazza Silvestri, has two 12th century Romanesque churches, a fountain, and a handsome palazzo. The smaller church is San Silvestro. It has a dark, austere interior with only a few faded frescoes here and there. But that only added to the ancient mystique of the place. Meanwhile, the larger Chiesa di San Michele Arcangelo dominates the opposite side of the square. The hill town of Deruta is known for its colorful pottery, made here since the 12th century and considered the finest in Italy. Our first stop was at the commercial factories at the base of the hill, outside the old town, where we were surprised by the wide range of handmade ceramic items, including tabletops and huge urns, as well as the smaller pieces we were expecting to see. They were all beautiful. At one of the factories, we were able to see some of the artists at work. A short distance up the hill, we found the town itself to be charming. The main square, with its churches and fountain, was lined with smaller ceramic shops. On the left in the background, we can see the tower of the Church of San Francesco, which dates to 1388. The interior of the church is in the Gothic style and incorporates reminders of Deruta's ceramic trade, including the main altar, which depicts the Last Supper in ceramic tiles. Above the altar, a crucifix is surrounded by the brightly painted apse. This side chapel is also decorated with a number of ceramic pieces, both on the walls and on the altar itself. Other parts of the church display some 14th century frescoes. Back outside, other buildings also incorporate ceramic details. A few feet away, we discovered a ceramic artist's studio with its own ancient furnace, which the owner showed us as part of an impromptu tour. Ceramics have been made here for hundreds of years. In a field just outside the town walls of Gubbio stand the remains of a Roman amphitheater. This impressive structure dates to the 1st century BC. It's one of the finest and most extensive Roman remains in all of Umbria. When Francis left his father's house in Assisi, some friends of his here in Gubbio took him in. This 13th century church, dedicated to St. Francis, is built on the site of their home. Inside the church, the soaring central nave leads to the altar, above which, in the central apse, appears this 13th century fresco of Christ and Four Saints, done by an anonymous artist. To the left of the altar, in the side apse, is a 14th century fresco cycle by Ottaviano Nelli, depicting the story of the Virgin. The Romanesque church of San Giovanni was also constructed in the 13th century. It stands on the site of an early Christian baptistry, which presumably is why the church is dedicated to John the Baptist. Partway up the hill, we reached the 14th century Palazzo dei Consoli. It stands guard at one end of the town's main square, where today everyone was getting ready for Gubbio's annual Crossbow Archery Festival, which was to take place the following day. As we continue still further up the hill, we reach this terrace, giving us an opportunity to look back on our progress. There's the first church we visited, San Francesco, at the base of the hill. And here's the palazzo that borders the square where we were just watching the archers. And now finally, we've made it all the way up to the Cathedral of Gubbio. The Duomo was built in the 12th century. Parts of the interior are especially vibrant and colorful, including the apse and this side chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary with a beautiful domed ceiling. Civita di Bonareggio is perched atop a rock precipice that juts up hundreds of feet from the valley floor below. Access to the town is made much easier by the modern causeway, but soon you reach the 12th century Romanesque arch leading to a passageway cut out of the rock by the Etruscans 2,500 years ago. Inside, the town is a charming network of medieval streets and flower-bedecked houses. A fine church stands on the main square of town. The ancient pillars in front of it remind us that this was also a place of worship in pre-Christian times, the site having been occupied by a Roman temple and before that by an Etruscan one. It was a common practice in the Baroque period to whitewash the interior of churches, but when an earthquake struck Civita in 1695, it peeled away the white coating, revealing this early fresco above the high altar, immediately dubbed the Madonna of the Earthquake. The edges of the town reveal marvelous views of the valley below. You can walk down the narrow, ancient path that was used to reach the town before the modern causeway was built. It leads to caves that were cut out of the rock in medieval and even Etruscan times, including this one, which was converted into a church following the 1695 earthquake. Back on the other side of the causeway, we found this charming restaurant with a terrace overlooking Civita, the perfect conclusion for our visit. Orvieto is one of the crown jewels of Umbria. This hill town sits majestically high above the valley floor on a tuft of volcanic stone. While the entire town is charming, it is the Duomo that stands out as the most impressive sight, not only of the town but of the entire region. When you finally stand in front of it, there can be no question as to why it is so celebrated. The upper portion is adorned with gleaming mosaics from circa 1330. Meanwhile, the bottom portion of the cathedral is decorated with detailed stone carvings, also from the early 1300s, depicting various scenes from the Bible. Here we see Judgment Day, with the redeemed being welcomed into heaven, while the damned are being led off in the opposite direction. Another section depicts the creation story, with God removing Adam's rib and using it to create Eve. Soon thereafter, the serpent orchestrates the fall of mankind at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But thousands of years later, a child is born who repairs that rift. And the rest of the New Testament story unfolds from there. Inside the cathedral, the striped marble nave leads to a colorfully frescoed apse surrounding the high altar. One of the cathedral's side chapels contains a spectacular series of 15th century frescoes by Luca Signorelli depicting the end times. It begins with the Antichrist preaching to an all-too-willing audience, with Satan himself feeding him his next line. The torments of hell await those who succumb to the devil's lies. While the followers of Christ are raised to everlasting peace in heaven. Virtually every inch of the walls and ceilings are covered with Signorelli's colorful frescoes. Elsewhere in town, we also stopped for a peek at San Domenico and its early frescoes. And the 12th century Palazzo del Popolo, which was the town's city hall in the Middle Ages. We hadn't even planned to go to Bagno Vignoni, but the owner of our B&B recommended that we stop there, even if only for a few minutes. So, on our trip up to Montalcino, we paid it a visit. We're glad we did. The ancient thermal baths located here date back to Roman times, and they were even more popular in the Middle Ages. Here we can see the hot springs bubbling up in the middle of the baths. But most of all, it was simply the pleasant surroundings that made for a delightful stopover. Montalcino is another typical Tuscan hill town, known for its fine wines. Wine aficionados make a pilgrimage to Montalcino to sample the town's famous Brunello wine. But we just enjoyed walking the narrow streets and peeking our heads inside the town's several medieval churches. The town also has a fortress dating to the 14th century. Just 6 miles south of Montalcino is a 12th century abbey set amidst olive groves. This Romanesque gem boasts some fine sculptural details, as you'll see in our photos. The monks sing Gregorian chant throughout the day, and we were fortunate enough to attend one of these services. It was one of the highlights of our trip. The tiny town of Pienza is dominated by its main square, where we find the city hall with its 13th century bell tower. Pienza was home to Pope Pius II, who remodeled the town in the Renaissance style in the 1400s. The facade of the Duomo, on the opposite side of the square, reflects those classic symmetrical Renaissance proportions. The vaulted interior is equally beautiful. Down one of Pienza's charming narrow streets, we happened upon another early church with a beautifully frescoed apse. Montepulciano is another Tuscan hill town known for its fine wines. While the town itself is charming, we spent most of our time at San Biagio Church, at the base of the hill outside of town. San Biagio is the town's most impressive Renaissance structure. The church's proportions in the Greek cross plan give the building a pleasing rhythmic quality. It has an impressive dome located above the main altar. Here we see the dome from the interior. The next day, while driving from our B&B in Orvieto up to Cortona, we noticed a pretty little hill town in the distance, and so we decided to stop at Città della Pieve. As it turns out, the town was home to the great 15th century painter Perugino, whose artwork can be found several places in town. In fact, the last photo you'll see in this section is of his Baptism of Christ in the town's cathedral. The main square of town is graced by the bell tower of the cathedral on the left and the civic tower on the right. The Church of Santa Maria dei Bianchi is in the northern arm of town. Other churches include San Pietro and Santa Maria dei Servi. We had lunch at a restaurant along the shores of Lake Trasimeno, and afterwards, Pam couldn't resist the temptation to go wading at the water's edge. Cortona is the hill town made famous by the book Under the Tuscan Sun. The town's cathedral dates back to the 11th century. It stands on a square overlooking the valley below and the mountains in the distance. At the top of town stands the church dedicated to Cortona's own Saint Margaret, who lived in the 13th century. It has a strikingly beautiful interior. On the outskirts of town stands the Renaissance church of Santa Maria Nuova, built in 1554. We stayed at the Locanda Rosati near Orvieto for 3 nights while visiting the hill towns of Western Umbria and Tuscany. This is the back patio where each night we greeted the other guests and enjoyed a glass of wine before going into the dining hall for dinner. And this is where we enjoyed magnificent meals every evening while getting to know the other visitors from all around the world. The grounds were also lovely, with some beautiful garden areas. To end our trip, we spent 2 nights in Rome. Our sightseeing began with the magnificent Colosseum. Completed in 80 AD, it was the largest public venue in all of antiquity, with seating for 50,000 spectators. Just to its side is the Arch of Constantine, built by the emperor to commemorate his military victory in AD 312, which was foreshadowed by a cross in the sky, leading to the legalization of Christianity. The recently restored arch has some exquisite carvings glorifying previous emperors. The Pantheon is perhaps the world's best preserved ancient structure. It was originally built in 27 BC by the Emperor Agrippa, and the front portico, with its one-piece granite columns shipped from Egypt, is from that period. The rest of the structure was rebuilt 150 years later by the Emperor Hadrian, including the exceptional coffered dome, which confounded architects for centuries thereafter, and served as the inspiration for Michelangelo's dome in St. Peter's. The oculus at its center is 18 feet across, letting in plenty of light. One of Christianity's great early churches, Santa Maria Maggiore is the only basilica in Rome that retains its original 4th century proportions. Some exceptional mosaics line the nave and apse. St. Peter in Chains is the 5th century church built to house the much venerated shackles that held Peter while he was imprisoned in the Mamertine jail. The chains are on display in a case at the high altar. Also here is Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses. The original St. Peter's Basilica was commissioned in the year 324 and built atop the Apostles' Tomb. Today's church building, from the 1500s, stands on a vast elliptical piazza designed by Bernini and lined with Doric columns. The colonnade is topped with statues of some 140 saints. The ancient Egyptian obelisk in the center of the square originally stood in Nero's circus, the site of Peter's execution. Beyond it are the papal apartments. The interior of the basilica is so huge, it's hard to take it all in. It's fully the size of 2 football fields, with every inch adorned with marble and gilding and Renaissance and Baroque decoration. Directly under the dome, Bernini's bronze canopy marks the location of the papal altar. Another ancient Egyptian obelisk stands in front of the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. It sits atop an elephant base designed by Bernini. As was the case with the church of the same name that we saw in Assisi, Santa Maria sopra Minerva was built on top of an ancient temple to Minerva. The church was constructed in 1280 and is Rome's only Gothic church. One of its treasures is this little-known Michelangelo statue of Christ bearing the cross. San Ignazio is a riot of Baroque decoration, including the dome in the ceiling, which doesn't really exist. It's just a painted illusion. The ceiling is filled with more surprises, as characters seem to be falling down from the sky. But this richly appointed side chapel is no illusion, including its beautiful dome. The Trevi Fountain may not be an artistic masterpiece, but it's certainly one of the best-loved landmarks of Rome. Completed in 1762, this well-known Baroque fountain represents water in its various forms, from Triton blowing his conch shell to the figure representing Ocean standing atop the fountain. At a nearby store, Pam worked with the shopkeeper to design a glass bead necklace as a special souvenir. Then we returned to our hotel to enjoy a drink on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. The crypt of the Capuchin Church is one of the most unusual you'll ever see. It's decorated with the bones of 4,000 monks. The work began in 1528 and was finally completed in 1870. The sobering inscription reads, "What you are, I once was. What I am, you someday will be." We'll say goodbye to Rome with some night photography.